Good evening, everybody. Nice to see the turnout for this evening's event. Thank you for coming. I'm Darielle Tallarico. My company is Tipping Point Strategies, and I have a contract with Yukon Development Corporation to do the public engagement for the next generation hydro project. So tonight, what we have, just a couple of things. I hope everybody picked up this document when they came in the door, because there's probably, I think, 6 thick documents that over the next 2 days that we're going to be releasing. But if you want the quick and sort of the cheater version, you can grab this document and all the highlights are in it. If you want to come back tomorrow night, you can get the other, I think, 5 documents that go with this one that we're going to be doing tonight. Or you can go online, and on our website, they're all going to be listed. And we might have a few sticks in the back as well that have some of it on there. So, lots of reading is available, lots of information. I'd just like to point out our board chair, Yukon Development Corporation board chair, Joanne Fairley, is here tonight. And a number of board members. So, should I go through you all again? Okay, so Michael Laurier, we've got Colin Young, John Weirda, are you here? Yes. Dan Reams, I don't want to forget you. Are you here? Oh, nope. Okay. Bill Labarge, are you here? Joanne Herrick? Ed Schultz? And I think I got everybody. So that's the board of the Yukon Development Corporation. So if you have some comments later when we break up after the speaker event and you want to talk to one of the board members, they're here for you to chat with. Also, just a couple more things before I invite our new president, Yukon Development Corporation's new president, Justin Furby, to speak. I just wanted to let you know that we've been working all day today. We had a workshop that went all day, and we're doing another workshop that'll go half the day tomorrow, and another public speaking event tomorrow. So the purpose of today's, both days' workshop is to have a fact-based discussion, which carries on from the discussions we've already been having. They started last January. We had one in January, and I think in February. We had a First Nation forum in May, and now we're having this workshop to release the remaining papers that were promised as part of what we call the Next Generation Hydro Project. The Next Generation Hydro Project, I'm sure Justin will go into this a bit more, but it is based on a directive that was given to Yukon Development Corporation to look at hydro, to look at the viability of potential hydro projects. So I'll let Justin carry on from that point when he comes up. The paper today, though, is one we're calling Putting Next Generation Hydro into Context, Other Solutions to Meet Yukon's Long-Term Future Energy Needs. And that's what Peter Helen, who's sitting over here, he will be speaking today and presenting this paper. Peter is with Midgard Consulting. So again, I'm emphasizing the purpose of today's workshop and tomorrow's is to have a conversation, and we're trying to provide you with all the information as it's being developed and being shared and given over to the Yukon Development Corporation board. And then I think Justin will explain the rest of the process for you and what comes after, like what the next steps after this are. So with that, I think I'll just invite Justin to come up, and he will say a few words. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Darielle. I think you took my notes, Darielle. I could ad-lib, though.
These are your notes?
They are. It's more a couple bullets than a speech. So today has actually been really great this morning, and one of the things that we talked about was YDC's role in the energy due diligence of the Yukon. I think most of you know there's lots of partners that we have. A few of them would be, for example, EMR. I think recently you saw that they released the IPP policy. We also have, of course, a subsidiary, YEC, that currently are going through their 20-year resource strategy. And as we also have Energy Solutions that talk to us a little about a program called In Demand. One of the responsibilities that we have, as Darielle alluded to, is in a directive to look at next generation hydro. And this is looking at energy solutions for 30 to 50 years out. And we were tasked with doing significant due diligence, although it's early days, on looking at potential investments in next generation hydro. And so today, what we wanted to do was talk about how this may fit into other energy solutions. So Peter, who will speak after me, is going to talk about some of the other green energy solutions that also can be considered. And one of the things at the board level we talked about is when you do industry standard due diligence, you in essence look at the 360-degree questions that you need to apply in essence to see if you're going down the right path. And Peter will talk about, in fact, there are other solutions that have to be considered, and there's pluses and minuses to everything. One of the things that in this new role that I have has been a very important part and imperative is on our projects, the next generation projects, is to go out to the First Nation communities and start talking about shared values, shared interest, deepening our understanding of concerns, and ultimately seeking partnership. That is very important, I think, on all the energy investments into the future, and in particular for our work on next generation hydro. One of the other things that has been a very important message that we're putting out is we are very early into this planning process. As we're finding out through the national, one of the national organization of hydro planning, it takes 10 to 15 years for actual planning to decide when you have a potential investment. We are in the early stages of looking at the screening process of determining which projects potentially could be viable. So in essence, we are still looking at a number of years, 7 or 8 or 9 years later, before an investment can be made. And so we're just in essence, the screening process, and all of it has done to date is desktop. We haven't actually had an opportunity to ground truth. And one of our really important messages in the community is saying, when we go out there and look at trying to, in essence, provide some sensitivity to our studies and get into the field, that really is the strong message that we need First Nation partnership on these projects. And so finally, to conclude, what today and tomorrow night is really our opportunity to come back to the public again and report on our due diligence to date, because obviously with the public funds and in essence our board and our minister, it is absolutely important that in every step of the way we have transparency and we continue the dialogue. So today is just one more opportunity, and as we go forward, obviously we'll have much more chances to speak with the public, with First Nations, with communities, with levels of government. And equally important, our real message today is we need to be proactive in coming out and speaking to the public and continue to do so. So thanks. With that, I will ask Peter maybe to get into the next presentation.
Just a quick note, I'm going to interrupt once in a while just to break down the terminology, because there's a lot of terminology in this presentation. So every once in a while I'm just going to say, hey, what does that mean? Let's explain that. And as a precursor to that, can everybody hear me? As a precursor to that, this is school now, sorry. But these are some of the key concepts to watch for. You're going to see us talking about energy and capacity, and there's a difference between this that Peter will explain tonight. And then full and forecast LCOE. LCOE is a measure or an economic value for a potential project. That's how it's measured in this industry. And there's a difference between full and forecast that we'll get into as well. And just the other point that a lot of you know in this room, I know, that we're an islanded grid. We are not connected to any transmission system other than ourselves, right? We're not connected to BC or Alaska. Okay.
Thank you very much. As stated, my name's Peter Helland. I'm the CEO of Midgard Consulting. As part of the Next Generation project, we are teamed with several other consulting firms, SLR Consulting, Steve Morrison, who's just disappeared, Kawa Engineering, J.D. Mullard and Associates, and several other Yukoners and Hatfield Consultants. So when we talk about Midgard, really it's about the Midgard team, not just Midgard Consulting itself. As Darielle indicated, what we'll be discussing here today is putting next generation hydro into context, into the Yukon context in particular. So today's conversation, I'll give you a brief introduction, a quick overview of some methodology, then a sort of a recap of Yukon demand, which was covered in a previous evening session earlier in the year, or I guess really at the beginning of the year, looking at some of the generation resource options that are available in the Yukon, and then spending most of our time, hopefully, discussing different energy development scenarios, different ways you could combine the generation resource types that are available in the Yukon and how they work together to meet the Yukon's forecasted need for energy and capacity. And finally, some very brief conclusions. Introduction. The objective of the paper, we call it alternatives for shorthand, but basically putting next generation hydro into context, was to review alternative energy development scenarios for the Yukon based on providing next generation hydro context by presenting impacts and trade-offs, promoting a fact-based discussion, this was mentioned previously, to support the conversation of energy development and the different scenarios and choices that Yukoners can make, and providing a consistent framework with which to compare next generation hydro with other options that Yukoners have. So the Yukon electrical grid, brief summary, it's an islanded grid, and that means once again that the Yukon does not have an electrical connection or a transmission line connection to your neighbors. So there's no transmission line that runs from the Yukon into Alaska, for example, to Fairbanks. There's no connection down into British Columbia. You are an island. And what that means is that you must be self-reliant. You must generate all your own energy as required, when required, be it in the summertime or in the dark of winter. So as a result, the Yukon operates as an electrical island. And currently, there's 92 megawatts of hydroelectric capacity installed, primarily in the facilities in Whitehorse, Ajax, and Mayo. I know there's a hydro facility in Fish Lake that ATCO operates as well. 39 megawatts of thermal generation, and when we talk about thermal generation in the Yukon context, what we mean is diesel generation and natural gas generation. In the broader context, thermal could also imply things like coal-fired generation, but you don't have any of that in the Yukon. So for our purposes here today, if we use the word thermal generation, what we really mean is diesel generation and natural gas generation. And then there's also a small wind farm as well. Methodology. Long story short, we established some assumptions. We looked at the forecast energy and capacity needs for the Yukon from 2035 to 2065. We identified different resource options, generation resource options that are available in the Yukon and basically are available for use in the Yukon to meet your needs, your gaps in energy and capacity. We looked at several scenarios where we combine these generation resource options in different combinations, and then we sort of summarize our findings and describe some of the trade-offs, the gives and takes with different approaches. For each of the scenarios and generation types, there were 4 primary factors of interest. And these are factors of interest that we've been looking at throughout this next generation activity. So starting back in 2014, we were looking at 4 primary factors: technical, economic, socioeconomic, and environmental. For the purposes of this paper, however, we've simplified those 4 factors of interest for the purposes of facilitating a conversation without getting bogged down in too many details. So from a technical standpoint, we were looking at energy and capacity for the different generation types in the scenarios. In terms of economics, we're looking at 2 economic indicators: full utilization, levelized cost of energy, and forecast utilization. That forecast utilization, levelized cost of energy, and I'll get into what those mean in a little more detail later. and then socioeconomic. Basically, can there be social acceptance of the different generation types? And we've taken a simplified approach there, and I'll describe that shortly, but the idea there is to present generation types or generation options that should or may be socially acceptable in the Yukon context. And then environmentally, we've very much simplified what environmental impacts are by looking at the land use footprint, so the direct impact that the different generation types and different scenarios have upon the land, be it a water storage reservoir flooding an area, the right-of-way for a transmission line or road, basically the direct use of the land by a generation resource option, and then also looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. So before we start in earnest with the technical discussion, I want to just provide some foundational pieces or framework for people who haven't been attending the seminars to date or are new to the electricity scene. There's two primary parameters that we use to describe generation when we simplify it for the purposes of planning. And one is capacity, and the other is energy. And in today's discussion, we're going to use two different types of capacity: installed capacity and firm capacity. So what the differences are, if you will, is capacity is your instantaneous maximum peak. And there's two types. So there's your installed capacity. It's what is the absolute maximum that a generator of a particular type could produce? What is the maximum output that is possible? And we call that the installed capacity, sometimes known as the nameplate capacity for those who are familiar with that terminology. Then we have another type of capacity that we talk about, which is firm capacity. And this is the instantaneous ability to deliver energy on demand when required, as required. And what this typically means in the Yukon context is that you're supplying energy on demand in the quantity required during the winter time. Because it's during the Yukon winters when it's dark and cold that your peak demands occur and you have your greatest need for energy. So you may have a large installed capacity, but your ability to draw upon that resource is much lower in a sort of a reliable, dependable, on-demand kind of way. And then we also have energy, and it's the use of power over time. So capacity is instantaneous, whereas energy is the consumption over time. And I'll use an analogy to help describe that for people if there's still some doubts. And we've been playing around with different analogies, but the one I'll try is you have a home, and you heat your home using wood, a wood stove. So you have your pile of wood outside the house. The size of your pile of wood is how much energy you have available to yourself. It's the fuel you have available. So there's a certain amount of energy in that pile of wood. Capacity is your ability or the rate at which you can burn the wood. So for example, you may have one small wood stove in your house. Relatively small capacity because it's a small wood stove. So you can slowly over time use all the energy in your wood pile by burning it, but it would take you a long time. And you may also have another problem in the Yukon context where during those cold, dark nights of winter, it's not able to keep up with the heating requirements for your house. So you could increase your capacity. Let's say have a bigger wood stove or two wood stoves. So you're able to increase your throughput of burning wood. So one is the energy you've got stored and you're able to burn and turn into heat, and your capacity is how quickly or how much energy you can burn. So one is how quickly you can burn the wood, and the other is how much wood you have to burn over an extended period of time. So we have these two parameters: energy, the size of your wood pile; capacity, how many wood stoves or the size of your wood stove and how much heat you can generate. We also look at generation types according to their resource. So we tend to have renewables and non-renewables. Renewables, they're basically Mother Nature's bounty, if you will. Sun, wind, rain, or water flowing down our rivers. These are renewable energy sources. Non-renewable, primarily fossil fuels. So in our case, natural gas, or in the Yukon case, natural gas and diesel, so fossil fuels. And then also firm and intermittent. So firm means you can draw on that generation resource on demand when you want it, as you want it. And intermittent, well, the energy gets generated when the fuel supply is available. So if it's windy that day and your wind turbine is turning, great, you've got energy. If the wind stops blowing, you don't. It's intermittent. Your fuel supply is intermittent. And when we look at sort of classifying resources, they tend to fill one of three roles. Either they operate as baseload, which is shown here in red, and what they're doing is they're simply on, the generation resource is on, and just steadily outputting energy all day long, every day. Then we have in green what I'll call our intermittents, and they are things like wind, solar, run-of-river hydro. They generate electricity as and when the fuel supply is available. So the simple example is solar. It generates solar energy when the sun is out. If you get clouds, if the sun sets for the night, it ceases to produce. So you have your intermittent generation that produces energy as and when your fuel supply is available. Another example would be wind. If the wind's blowing, you have more generation. If the wind stops blowing or dies down, you have less generation. And then there's a third type, what we call load following, and what its purpose is to fill the gap between demand, shown in the sort of with the black line here, and your base load and your intermittent. So it sort of fills the difference or the shortfall between your base load and intermittents and your demand. And one thing about electrical grids and electrical networks is you have to instantaneously match generation to demand second by second. In fact, millisecond by millisecond, but second by second, you're always matching your demand with your generation. So there's three very important roles that different generation types play. Economic factors. The Yukon is an islanded grid, and we keep saying this, but it has some very profound economic implications for Yukoners. A generation resource can produce a certain quantity of energy, but because the Yukon is an islanded grid, that energy that is produced may or may not be useful at the time it is produced. Because, basically because if the demand isn't sufficient to use all the energy that is produced at that instant, you have to either curb generation or somehow get rid of the surplus generation. So in the Yukon context, or in the southern context, I'll call it, where you have interconnections to your neighboring jurisdictions, any surplus you generate, what you would do is you would sell it or give it away to your neighbors. In the Yukon context, you can't do that. You have no connection to your neighbors. So what you end up with is sort of what we'll call three types of energy. You have energy that's useful and used, which is in these boxes, and then energy that is surplus to your needs. And if you evaluate the economics of a resource and it only produces energy at times when you don't need it, it's less valuable than a resource that produces energy in the quantities you need at the time you need it. So typically in southern Canada, if you will, you evaluate generation resources on their full utilization cost of energy, because you're able to make some use of all the energy that's produced by that asset, primarily through trade. You consume it locally, but you can also get rid of your surplus through trade. But in the Yukon context, it's only the energy that is generated and is useful to you at the time it is generated that has economic value. So what we look at in the Yukon context is what we call forecast utilization, levelized cost of energy. So it's the value of the energy that is actually produced and usefully used in the Yukon. And it's a small, the costs for forecast utilization will always be higher than for full utilization. Hopefully that answers the question. And then we look at socioeconomic factors. And I'll be honest with you, for the purposes of this study that we're talking about today, this report we're talking about today, we took a very simplified approach. Our assumption simply is that wind, solar, hydro, natural gas, diesel generation, these are all acceptable forms of generation in the Yukon context. And generations such as coal or nuclear aren't acceptable, and we're not considering them for the purposes of study today. So a very simplified approach, overly simplified, admittedly, but necessary to limit the scope of this study.
And just, we also didn't look at biomass and geothermal electricity as well in this particular study, but that could be, if we were to build future scenarios, that could be something that was considered. It just wasn't in this case.
And then environmental factors. Once again, a very simplified approach was taken, primarily to facilitate discussion without getting bogged down in the details of specific projects and specific project sites. We're looking at the general trade-offs between different generation technologies rather than choosing one particular site over another for today's discussion. The other simplification is that we're looking at the direct land use and the direct greenhouse gas emissions of the projects. And when I say direct, it's the actual footprint of the project itself when we're talking about footprint. And when we're talking about direct greenhouse gas emissions, it's the greenhouse gas emissions associated directly with the production of electricity. And what this means is we are not looking at the full life cycle costs or footprints, greenhouse gas costs and emissions or footprints. To make that a little more concrete, you have a natural gas facility, Whitehorse. It has a footprint. It has a transmission line connecting to the grid. That's its direct footprint. There is also footprint associated with the roads to bring natural gas in to that facility, to have an oil and gas field somewhere in, let's say, northwestern BC, a processing plant to refine the gas that comes out. We aren't looking at those indirect footprints for the purposes of conversation today. Similarly with greenhouse gases, it's the direct generation of electricity and not the greenhouse gases associated with, for example, manufacturing a wind turbine in Ontario, shipping it across the country, bringing it up, installing it, erecting it, and commissioning it. We're really only looking at, for the purposes of today's discussion, the greenhouse gases associated with directly generating electricity. So this will be a little bit of a review for people who were at two seminars ago. Baseline energy demand. So we, as part of our mandate for the larger next generation hydro project, we forecasted the energy requirements and the capacity requirements in the Yukon for 2035 to 2065. And here are the results, at least presented graphically. And there's two major findings. One, not surprising, your energy gaps are largest in the winter. It's cold, it's dark, your demand is highest, and your natural sources of energy, for example, water flowing through your rivers, is lowest. So your river flows are less. And as a result, you end up with larger gaps in the wintertime and much smaller gaps in the summertime. So this is a graph of energy gap by month for the years 2035, 45, 55, and 65. But the main message for you tonight is that the Yukon has a larger need for energy during the colder weather months, primarily November through April, and a lesser need for energy during the warmer months, May through October.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So what are the population forecast assumptions that are built into this model?
I don't, it's in our paper, it's on the web, and I don't know the specific assumptions that were made. I'll be honest with you. We took this as an output from that paper and brought it in, so I'm not that well versed on that, but you could go to the paper. It's on the website right now, the Next Generation Hydro website, and if you were really interested in those population assumptions, it would tell you those specifically. One of the assumptions is population continues to increase. The basic methodology, to get long story short, is past population growth is an indicator of future population growth. So if you want the big picture population assumption, that's probably the biggest one there is.
And if I could follow up, does it also make assumptions about mineral development or needs for some of the big mining projects, for example?
Yes. So what we did was we looked at historic mine connection to the grid over the last, I'm going to say 50 years, 40, 50 years, and sort of looked at what the typical connection amount of grid-connected mining was. And I believe it was 1.2 mines per year, kind of a strange number, but 1.2 mines per year of a certain size and type and energy shape, and then forecasted mining usage or energy usage assuming 1.5 mines per year on a go-forward basis. So slightly higher than historic averages. So from historic averages, about 1.2 typical mines, if you will, and we assumed 1.5 typical mines.
I forgot to mention, excuse me, that we're videotaping this, so.
Oh, right.
So when you ask a question, can you repeat it?
I'm supposed to repeat the question.
It's captured, but they're not videotaping you. They're just videotaping us. And those papers exist, and we can make sure you get a copy of them, but they're also on the website that talk about this. Oh, and the point I was going to make is it's not looking at supplying need to some of the mines that are off-grid, right, at the moment, like, for instance, a casino. That's not part of this forecast calculation. So it's the simplistic view of this is it's the history informs the future. And there was a high scenario, a baseline scenario, and a low. They're using the baseline.
Yeah.
Jim. Yeah.
Can you just give a very quick explanation of why February looks like an odd man out there?
So the question is, why does February look like the odd man out?
So when we were looking at what the generation availability was of existing, the Yukon's existing resources, we used from the last resource plan, YEC's last resource plan, the expected shape that they would have from their hydro assets. And what it does is it sort of, there's a bit of a peak in February and then it tails off. And I think reading between the lines is that's primarily because their hydro storage gets used up, like their storage capacity gets used up, and they would move to thermal generation at that time, diesel generation at that time. So what you're seeing is hydro, the peak demands occur in like December and January, but hydro's starting to tail off. And as a result, March and April would be filled not so much by hydro, but potentially by diesel generation or something. And that's why you see the bit of the dip.
So that doesn't include thermal generation then?
That's correct. Doesn't include thermal generation.
Okay.
But it's somewhat an artifact of the modeling. But the trend is clear. Demand is highest in the winter, lowest in the summer. And that's the important point. There's a little dip there, but not that important in the overall scheme of things. But good question. Baseline capacity gap, no surprise, the demand for peak capacity will be increasing over time from approximately 21 megawatts in 2035, increasing to 53 megawatts in 2065. So just somewhat a steady increase with time. Here's a summary for people. In 2035, approximately 100 gigawatt hours of energy per year required. In 2065, 265 gigawatt hours of energy. And to be clear, that's the energy gap that needs to be filled, not the total energy demand in the Yukon. To provide a little bit of context for people, what does that mean? Let's make it concrete. In 2035, the demand is approximately one white horse facility on the basis of its ability to provide winter energy. So one white horse facility providing winter energy. And that's the Yukon challenge, if you will, providing winter energy and capacity. In 2065, that increases to approximately 2 white horse facilities plus a Mayo, equivalent of one of the Mayo facilities. And these are very approximate, but just to give people a sense of context and scale. So generation resources, what did we look at? Like stated previously, we looked at wind, solar, next generation hydro, hydro with storage, a larger hydroelectric facility with water storage. We looked at small hydroelectric facilities with water storage, the dividing line being approximately 15 megawatts of installed capacity. Run-of-river hydro, distinct from hydro with storage in the sense that run-of-river hydro, basically there's no water storage across time. So the natural water flows that come into the project leave the project, and water doesn't stay with the project. So it doesn't shift water or store water for several months, moving it from summer to winter like the hydro projects with storage would do. So basically mimicking natural river flows. And then pump storage hydro. For those of you who are not familiar with pump storage hydro, and many people wouldn't be because it's not talked about that often, at least historically, it's coming more into the fore recently. The purpose of pump storage hydro is you use surplus energy, for example, energy in the summertime when you have surplus energy in the Yukon. You would use that surplus energy to take water from a lower reservoir and pump it uphill into an upper storage reservoir where you would leave that water until you want it, to use it for generation. So you're basically translating surplus energy at one time of day or year, season, in the Yukon sense, in the summer months, using it to store water in an upper reservoir for use in the winter. So you would generate in the winter using a pump storage project. So it's a way to store energy in the form of water in this case, but it's a type of energy storage project. And then, of course, natural gas generation. Any portfolio being considered is going to have some form of thermal generation to provide reliable sources of energy and capacity. So what we did was we took those different types of energy, those different energy generation types, the winds, the solars, the various types of hydro, natural gas. And we looked at them and we said, okay, we need to make some scenarios to evaluate what are we going to do? How are we going to put these different generation types together to create scenarios for evaluation? So one of the first steps was to look at the generation types on their ability to supply the Yukon's need for energy and capacity, primarily in the winter, on a standalone basis. Can that generation resource do it on its own? And the conclusion is mainly no, with two exceptions. Next generation hydro being a comparatively larger hydroelectric project with a larger reservoir for storing water, so able to store seasonally your surplus summer water that comes down the river in a larger reservoir and leave it intact for use in the winter. It's big enough to meet the forecast demand up to 2065. So it has the ability to supply energy and capacity to meet the Yukon's needs up to 2065. So it can do it on a standalone basis. Natural gas, the other one. You store fuel or you bring fuel in as required, and it's there waiting for you on demand as required, and it also has the ability to meet your forecast energy and capacity needs up to 2065. So those become two, if you will, standalone scenarios. So the question gets asked, well, what happens if the other generation resources team up together? They work collaboratively. Can they also meet the Yukon's demand for energy and capacity? So two additional scenarios were developed on the basis of combining wind, solar, small hydro with storage, run-of-river, and as you'll see here in a second, different scenarios with and without pump storage. So the idea here is, okay, let's look at the different scenarios and see if these different generation types can team up together, work together collaboratively to meet the Yukon's needs. So we came up with 4 scenarios. We have scenario 1, natural gas. Fully populated by natural gas. By no means do we expect that the Yukon would only employ natural gas generation to meet its energy and capacity needs, but we provide this scenario as really context and something to compare against, a baseline, if you will. The next scenario is next generation hydro. Once again, standing alone, does next generation hydro meet your needs? And the answer will be yes, but we just provide it because the purpose of this paper, after all, is to provide next generation hydro in context. So you need something to compare and contrast against next generation hydro. So there's 2 renewable portfolio scenarios. What we called scenario 3, and it's renewables, but it does not include pump storage. So it's the renewables of wind, solar, small hydro with storage, and run-of-river. A side note, we also allow natural gas generation to appear in the portfolio, but only for the purposes of meeting capacity requirements. All the energy, the forecast energy gaps that we discussed are met by the resource types listed in green. So wind, solar, small hydro with storage, and run-of-river. And natural gas plays the role of providing some peak capacity. So for a few hours a year or a day or two a year. So very small usage, but very important usage, because without that peaking, that trying to hit that absolute peak that happens in that darkest, coldest winter night, you'd black out the grid. So it's an economic source of capacity and energy to meet that very specific niche need. And then to compare and contrast what pump storage hydro can do for you, we added pump storage hydro to scenario number 4 to provide a renewables portfolio with pump storage. So the same technologies as in scenario 3, but with the addition of of pumped storage. And these were the 4 scenarios that we evaluated. So natural gas. 2065, we have our forecast demand shown here in black. We have your existing hydro assets in the Yukon. So this is your existing hydro facilities, Whitehorse, Ajax, the Mayo projects, for example. And then natural gas fills the rest. Not surprising, it can. You've got a fuel supply. You turn it on when you need it. You burn the gas. Everything is great. And natural gas closes the gap on its own. Scenario, so summary of it, you're basically looking at, in 2035, 22 megawatts of natural gas, and in 2065, 53 megawatts of natural gas, and that meets the demand. So we were talking about forecast utilization, LCOE. The cost is estimated at approximately $250 per megawatt hour. For those of you who use cents per kilowatt hour, that would be 25 cents per kilowatt hour. So $250 a megawatt hour or 25 cents per kilowatt hour. So this gives you a sense of sort of what the ballpark comparison is going to be. And relatively small direct footprint, it's a small postage stamp size lots of land that the facilities are on, but with significant greenhouse gas emissions. And not surprisingly, you're burning fossil fuels to meet your energy needs. So we use this somewhat as a comparator. We don't expect that this is what the Yukon would decide, but we provide it so that you have context. Next generation hydro. Same demand. Next generation hydro can meet the gap, but there's surplus available. One thing about the next generation hydro sites, as we'll be discussing in more detail tomorrow, is that they do have excess capacity relative to what is needed up to the end of 2065. And it primarily, not surprisingly, comes mostly in the summertime when natural river flows are the highest. You have snow melt and the rivers are swollen and moving quickly. And next generation hydro meets the capacity gap. None of this is particularly surprising. It's what you would expect. 38 megawatts in 2035, 57 megawatts in 2065. But what's interesting is the forecast utilization cost is similar. It's comparable to natural gas. So it's, the economics are roughly the same. The utilization, the utilization of the energy, and the energy we're talking about is just the energy under the black line. So just this useful part of the energy has a similar economic cost to natural gas generation. Much larger footprint, 18,000 hectares, primarily due to water storage reservoir, transmission lines, access roads being the major contributors to that. But no greenhouse gas. No greenhouse gases created for the purposes of generation. Understood on a full life cycle basis, there are additional greenhouse gases for the reservoir, construction, bringing in the materials, those types of things. But direct energy generation, and that's what we're talking about here tonight, no greenhouse gases. So renewables without pump storage. Not surprisingly, the different generation types team up together to work together. We have your existing hydro, as you will see in all the scenarios, a little bit of solar, wind in orange, wind shown here in orange, closing some of the gap, but not all of the gap, and that's, an important point for people to understand. Solar alone, wind alone are not sufficient to meet the Yukon's needs. You have to pair wind and solar with other generation types to meet the forecast needs for energy and capacity. And our findings are that it's primarily going to be filled with small hydro with storage. It's the most efficient of the other renewables. It's the most efficient source of winter energy and capacity, because that's what really is our limit, is the winter energy and capacity. And so what you have is a combination of solar, some wind, and small hydro with storage. And in this case, in this scenario, approximately 11 projects, typical projects, if you will. We looked at historic studies that have been done over the last 20, 30 years to develop a sense of what the typical hydro with storage project could look like or would look like as previously laid out, and it would be approximately 11 projects to fill that small hydro need. Interestingly enough, in 2065, you still need a little bit of natural gas to fill your capacity gap. Those few hours or a few days of the year where those peaks occur because it's cold and dark, you would employ some natural gas, approximately 9 megawatts worth, to meet your needs.
Okay, just to insert a little bit here, because there's people in the room that do this type of work. What percentage is the wind, and what percentage is the solar, and why did you base your assumptions on that?
Okay, so some people say, hey, why couldn't we just add more wind? You know, more and more and more wind. Well, the simple answer is at a certain point, adding more wind creates difficulties for operating the grid. So there are challenges operating the grid with more and more and more wind. So there's sort of what we'll call practical limits, integration limits on the maximum amount of wind that you could have. And especially as an islanded grid where you can't draw on your neighbors to shed surplus wind or import when the wind stops blowing, you have these limits. And for our study here, we used a 20% of peak demand for the limit on wind. So fairly aggressive assumption relative to what's typically used in the industry today of 10 to 15%. And what we did to achieve that was we assumed that there would be some integration resources added to the wind, such as utility scale batteries, to help with the integration of additional wind. And then solar was approximately 5 megawatts. A successful microgeneration program, which is going on right now, putting rooftop solar in and things like that, assuming that would continue to be successful.
Which is a government policy right now.
Yes.
Or a program where you can do the microgen policy. So that's what he's forecasting, the use of that microgen policy and people installing solar panels. So that's the assumption built in. Now, I noticed too, before you spoke about run-of-river, so am I correct, there's no run-of-river in this model?
Yeah, so the way I described it this morning is run-of-river was part of the draft, but it didn't get picked for the team. Run-of-river, compared to small hydro with storage, is an expensive source of winter energy and winter capacity. And as a result, what you would preferentially choose over run-of-river is small hydro with storage. So even though it was a candidate for selection, it didn't make the grade, if you will, and wasn't selected for the portfolio or to be participating in the portfolio. So when we look at this, we see that there's 11 small hydro projects, and you have to meet some of your capacity needs with LNG or with natural gas generation. So what does this mean? In 2035, 22 megawatts of wind, increasing to 29 megawatts. In 2065, 1 megawatt of solar, increasing to 5 megawatts of solar, 39 megawatts of small hydro, increasing to 72 megawatts of small hydro with storage, and approximately 9 megawatts of natural gas. That's a long list of projects, and that long list of projects reflects itself in the price, $360 per megawatt hour, or 36 cents per kilowatt hour. So comparatively more expensive. And a larger footprint associated with the larger number of projects, but similar to next generation hydro, no greenhouse gas emissions for direct generation. So the question becomes, okay, Peter, that's nice. So what does pumped storage hydro do? How does it change the picture when you add it to scenario 4? And the answer is it makes your renewables much more effective because it takes this surplus summer energy and it transfers it to the winter. So let's have a look at that. So here we have scenario 4 with pump storage added. And what it's doing is it's using energy in those surplus summer months. So it's taking some of this surplus energy up here, and you see the generation here, and it's transferring that energy into the winter time. So it's moving summer energy into the winter. And as a result, making your renewables far more efficient, far more effective. What else does that mean? It means the number of small hydro projects required is reduced from approximately 11 to approximately 6. So it almost cuts the number of small hydro projects in half. You've added one pump storage project, and you're able, by the shifting of that surplus summer energy from the summer to the winter, to reduce the number of small hydro projects required. So a significant benefit as a result of this pump storage project. And it provides a fair amount of firm capacity in 2065, about a third, a little over a third. Small hydro provides about half, and LNG or natural gas generation still required for those few hours, few days every year. So what do we have? 22 megawatts of wind increasing to 29, so no change there. 1 megawatt of solar increasing to 5 megawatts of solar, no change there. But small hydro, 13 megawatts to 39 megawatts, almost half. So it's the reduction from 11 projects to 6. And a 20 megawatt pump storage project is what was assumed for the purposes of this study, and some natural gas generation. But what's most notable is with the reduction in number of projects required is the cost comes down to approximately $270 per megawatt hour, which is effectively, if you want to think about it, equivalent in terms of economics with natural gas and with next generation hydro. So they're similar. They're comparable on an economic basis. There are also similar footprints when compared to next generation hydro, which was 18,000 hectares, and this is 20,000 hectares, and no greenhouse gases. So interestingly, pump storage hydro, potentially very valuable in the Yukon because it unlocks the value of renewable generation, this ability to shift energy from the summer to the winter on a seasonal basis. So, summary, what does all this mean, Peter? Long story short, so if you just walked in, you could skip all the rest of the presentation. All the scenarios 1 through 4 can meet the forecast need for energy and capacity, with the understanding that the renewable scenarios will require some natural gas or diesel generation, probably natural gas, to fill the gap. Scenario 1, just natural gas. Scenario 2, next generation hydro. Scenario 4, renewables with pump storage. Similar economic costs to the Yukon. So, interesting. Should all be potentially acceptable, assuming you can address the social and environmental issues in a suitable way. That'll be a lively discussion over the next few years. And the footprints are on the same, roughly the same order of magnitude. And unlike with natural gas generation, direct generation is 0, or in the case of the renewables, near 0 on a yearly basis. So, conclusions. All scenarios meet the forecasted demand. Natural gas and next generation hydro can be standalone. The other generation types must be combined together. And one could argue pump storage probably part of the mix because of its ability to unlock that seasonal transfer of energy from summer to winter. So, which generation type does the Yukon want to pursue? Well, that's an open question, but it is a selection among trade-offs with regards to economics, greenhouse gases, land use, and social acceptability. What else does that mean? When putting next generation hydro into context, it remains a viable candidate. It's not clear that the other scenarios are that so much better that next generation hydro doesn't remain a viable candidate. It has similar costs compared to the other generation types, zero GHG emissions for direct generation, and it meets the energy and capacity needs. Thank you.